Well, like Chris said, we're going to talk a little bit about sacrifice today. We're going to talk about giving, and we've been in a series we started last week called Never Enough. We've been talking about the consumeristic culture, and today, in addition to sacrifice, I guess I want to talk about it from a presence of perspective. I think perspective is incredibly important as we talk through these things, and I was reminded of that this week. So this week, I don't know if you know, but we just basically didn't go to school. We had a school day. We had school on Friday, but the weather has been not conducive to putting children in a school bus, and so we've been home with them. And it's fine. It's fine. It's all fine. It's all on fire, but it's all fine. And I was thinking about that this week as I'd say it was Wednesday. I kind of had a moment. That's what we call it at my house. I had a moment where I was like, it's time for these kids to go back to school. I will shovel the walks myself, right? Like the whole thing. And I don't think I was the only one. I got some prayers from some folks that were like, pray for me, Pastor. And I was like, pray for me. So I get it. But I was in this space and I was thinking to myself, like, why is this happening? And to be clear, I decided that it's my fault. I'm sorry. That's really what this is. This whole opening is really me confessing and apologizing. Because as I was standing there saying, why is this happening? Why would these kids not go to school? I had this flashback to January, all the way back to January at the beginning of the year, when I was setting my New Year's resolutions, because I still do those, and I was thinking to myself, I want to spend more time with my kids this year. Friends, be careful what you pray for. You just might get it. Right? It's a matter of perspective. It really is. Back then, when I was caught up in the busyness of running from here to there, when I was caught in the busyness of work and life and all of the stuff, I thought, boy, if we could just have a couple of days where we couldn't do anything, it was just us, and we could sit around and play games and hang out and laugh, wouldn't that just be amazing? And then in the thick of it, all I wanted was out of it. Perspective matters. It changes the way that's the definition of it, right? It's the way we view things, right? It changes. When we change our perspective, we change the way we view and feel about a situation. Today, as we look at culture, the consumeristic culture, the nature of the world around us, I invite you to change your perspective. Last week, we talked a little bit about this. We talked about how we are stuck in the myth of more, how we're stuck in this space where we are told that more is better, and what we really need is more, and that if a little bit will do, then more has got to work. Like, I'm telling you, that is the way that we are told to believe. I know this because I take ibuprofen. I take it occasionally. And I do not know that I cannot consciously remember a single moment where I ever just took one ibuprofen. I can't think of it. I can't think of a single time when I take one ibuprofen. In fact, I will not tell you how many ibuprofen I take at a time because I don't want letters. I mean, I am an RN. It feels safer because I know it's not, right? But if one works, then 6 have got to work better, right? That's the way we think about things, right? If one works, then 6 has got to work better. If a little bit works, then a lot has got to be the answer to whatever's going on. That's the way we're told to think. And we're told that all of that will satisfy, that the more that we have, the more we'll be satisfied, and the more that eventually we'll reach this place of contentment, that we can buy our way into feeling peace and contentment. And friends, I got to tell you, I don't know that that's working for me. I'm trying it. I'm trying it real hard. Like, I really have always, I grew up with this. I was raised this way. And I'm not picking on any of my ancestors. You all know I have a beloved relationship with my grandparents. But I remember driving around and hearing Grandpa say, if he'd sell that piece. If he'd sell that piece. Because farmers only want 2 things. They want the weather to change, and they want the land that butts up next to theirs. That's all they ever want. Just those 2 things. If he'd sell that piece. I have been taught from a young age that more might satisfy, that more might make it better. And so as we read passages like we did last week in Matthew chapter 6 that talk about storing up treasures on earth versus storing up treasures on heaven, my question is, how is it working for you? Do you feel like the more thing is working? Because in my own life, it's not. In fact, the more I have, the more I want, and the more I worry. The more I have, the more I want, and the more I worry. Now, to be clear, I'm at no point in this message am I going to tell you to sell all your things and become a hermit. I mean, if the Lord's calling you, go for it. But that's not my life either. But there is a way that we can make a shift and live differently. There is a thing that we can do that cures that aching that we find ourselves in. There is this moment, this change of perspective that allows us to live different, to feel different. See, the world tells us there's only so much to go around. There's only so much pie. And if you don't get your piece now, there ain't going to be any pie later. I grew up in a large family. I'm raising a large family. I know the get your seconds while you're in line now because you won't get seconds later kind of thing. This happens. Listen, I love Kraft macaroni and cheese. I love Kraft macaroni and cheese. But no matter how much macaroni and cheese we seem to make, it is never enough at my house. I also really love fried potatoes. And you know what? I have never put fried potatoes in my refrigerator. I've never put them. I've never had leftover fried potatoes. I'm telling you, I made fried potatoes last night. I made 10 potatoes worth of fried potatoes. We were out of there was none that went in the refrigerator. Like, I have never had left. There is no amount of enough that allows me to have more. So I understand this scarcity mindset. I understand this idea. But when we shift and recognize that because of God there is abundance, we shift and realize that when we say, give us this day our daily bread, it means that every day there will be enough. When we recognize that there is no way for God to run out of love or grace or peace, then suddenly I'm less worried about getting mine and more worried about enough to go around. Suddenly, there's an abundance at work. Things don't feel so scarce. I want to show you a moment when Jesus made this real, when Jesus made this tangible. I want you to see this moment with fresh eyes. This is one of those stories that we read in children's books all the time, and you probably have this like nursery book understanding of what happened in this moment. And I want to be really clear. I'm not picking on your elementary Sunday school teacher. They do phenomenal work. But I want us to look at this with fresh eyes. I want us to see a moment in Jesus' life like we're seeing it for the first time. Potentially some of us are. And I want us to pay really close attention to what Jesus does and what Jesus doesn't do. Because often in the gospel, often when we talk about the life of Jesus, we get really hung up on the things Jesus did. And by the way, you should do that. You should pay attention to the things Jesus did. Right? But I think we should also, part of the ministry is the things that Jesus didn't do. Part of the ministry is the things that Jesus didn't say. The ways that he didn't interact with people. I want you to catch what Jesus doesn't do. We're going to be in the Gospel of John this morning, chapter 6. I'm going to read the first few verses. This should be very familiar for you all. I'm reading from the New Living Translation today, mostly because this is the Bible that came off my shelf this morning. It should be pretty close to whatever you have. Let's dive into the text. After this, Jesus crossed over to the far side of the Sea of Galilee, also known as the Sea of Tiberias. A crowd kept following him wherever he went because they saw his miraculous signs as he healed the sick. Then Jesus climbed a hill and sat down with his disciples around him. It was nearly time for the Jewish Passover celebration. Jesus saw the huge crowd of people coming for him. He turned to Philip and asked, "Where can we buy bread for all these people?" He was testing Philip, for he already knew what he was going to do. Philip replied, "Even if we worked for months, there wouldn't be enough money to feed them all." Then Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up and said, "There is a young boy here with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what good is that with this huge crowd? Tell everyone to sit down," Jesus said. So they all sat down on the grassy slopes. The men alone numbered 5,000. Then Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks to God, and distributed it to the people. Afterwards, he did the same with the fish. And then they all ate as much as they wanted. And after everyone was full, Jesus told his disciples, "Now gather the leftovers so that nothing is wasted." They picked up the pieces and filled 12 baskets with scraps left by the people who had eaten the 5 barley loaves. The living word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Jesus has got a problem. Now, it feels like a problem to us. In fact, it gets really easy for us. We get all 2025 judgmental when we look back at the disciples. I got to tell you, I think the disciples, the older I get, the more relatable the disciples are. The older I get, the more I understand exactly where they're coming from. Jesus looks at this huge crowd coming, and he turns to Philip and says, "Where are we going to get them food?" And Philip's like, "What? Have you lost your mind? Do you see the number of people that are coming?" And we sit back with the advantage of hindsight, and we want to say, "Well, ye of little faith. What do you mean, where are we going to get the..." No, this is an actual question. Philip makes a lot of sense here. We could work for months and not feed all of these people. Are you kidding me? There's so many of them. Philip sees the problem. Jesus has already seen the solution. Philip sees the problem. Jesus has already seen the solution. Some of you all are looking at problems. You are staring in your life in the face of problems. Big, hairy, gnarly problems you can't see a way out of. Friends, Jesus has already seen the solution. Jesus has already seen it. When out of nowhere comes Andrew, who comes running up and says, "This kid here, he's got 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish." Now, I think what Andrew's saying is, because remember it says Jesus sees these people coming over the hill. I think Andrew's saying, let's hurry up and eat those before anybody else gets here. I can't, sometimes you just know things that aren't in the text. I'm just sure that's what Andrew's meaning. Let's hurry up and get this over with, because there ain't enough to go around. Now, I want to ask a question about that. Do you think this kid is the only one who actually has food there? You ever think about that? I don't buy that. I don't think this kid's the only one who has food. I know that because I've been part of the church my entire life. I picked 4 random church ladies out of this, send you all to the kitchen. You'd have a full potluck dinner by the time we were done with this worship service, just with the crumbs and the things left over in the kitchen pantry. I don't buy that. I've seen my wife take my kids to the zoo, and we leave with snacks and sandwiches and drinks and chips. I don't buy for a minute that the only people that had food in that gathering was this one little boy. You go to my car right now, I got a bag of Doritos stuck in the back seat. You mean tell me don't nobody in that 5,000 people have an emergency bag of Doritos? I don't buy it. I don't buy it. Here's what I think happened. I think there was a whole group of people who suddenly realized it was getting ready to be lunchtime. They realized that there was going to be food and that there was people there who didn't have food. And they looked at their little bit of food and they said, well, there isn't enough to go around. So, shh. Eat your Cheerios, keep them in your pocket. Somebody sees them, they may want to ask you for them. There's not enough to go around. There ain't enough to share. We ain't got enough to go around. The only one who looks at it and says, I don't have much, but I'm welcome to share, is this little child. Oh, how fitting. Only a kid would be naive enough to think, I don't have much, but here, you can have what I have. Only a kid would be naive enough to think, we can make this work with my 5 little pieces of bread and these 2 little fish. A meal. Only a kid would think to themselves, I'll share my sack lunch enough that it will go to feed all of these people. This is what Jesus means when he says you must approach faith like a child. Only a kid would see it. Only a kid would see it. Jesus takes the faith of that one little boy and multiplies it across thousands, proving that in the face of scarcity, there is always abundance. In the face of scarcity, there's always abundance. And so I turn my TV on and I hear people tell me that there isn't enough to go around. I sit and I listen to families talk about how there isn't enough time, there isn't enough energy, and it is impossible. I hear people tell me about how they got to do what they can do now because they may not be able to do later, over and over and over again. And every ounce of the gospel cries out, when you say there is scarcity, God shows up with abundance. It's all a matter of perspective. There's always enough. And there may be just enough. There's always enough. And here's what we miss in that story in 2025. Here's what you may not have caught. Did you catch where Jesus was when this happened? Did you catch where Jesus went? Let's go back and read it. Did you catch where Jesus was when this happened? The people that he was talking to, the people he was dealing with. Did you catch where it was? It says right here, after this, Jesus crossed over to the far side of the Sea of Galilee. The far side of the Sea of Galilee. Friends, when your Bible says that, it means he passed over to the pagan side of the Sea of Galilee. These weren't believers of people. Some of them were. These weren't faithful Jewish folk. Some of them were. This is why we get the 2 stories in Mark where we get the feeding of the 5,000 people and the 4,000, right? We get 2 different feeding of the multitude stories. One happens on the Jewish side and the other happens on the Gentile side. One of them happens on the faithful side, the monotheistic side, the Jewish side. The other happens on the pagan side. Jesus is standing in front of a group of people who don't even believe the way he believes when he feeds the multitude and says there is an abundance. Jesus doesn't ask any questions. There is no application. There's no test. There's no requirement. There's just a meal. Jesus takes the scarcity, tosses out the requirements, and supplies the abundance. The other thing that's interesting is we know that there was an entourage that followed Jesus, and that there were people in the room who were hate watching him. You ever hate watch something? I hate watch a lot of things because my wife likes terrible TV. You ever hate watch something? Right? You watching something and the whole time you're sitting there thinking, this is stupid. This is terrible. Oh, look, another episode's on. Oh, good, it's not just my house. Happens all the time, right? There are people who hate watch Jesus. We know that everywhere he went, there were people who were standing around talking, making a mockery of him, trying to catch him in his words. We know that there were people everywhere who followed him around, who all they wanted to do was talk about how ridiculous everybody that followed him was. We know there were people who wanted to trap him and pin him down and make him out to be a fool. We know that there were people who spent their whole mission in trying to discredit this thing they were doing. And do you know what? When I read John chapter 6, do you know what I realize? Those people got to eat too. The people who said he couldn't do it got to eat. The people who said there wasn't enough to go around got to eat. The people who said, how in the world could you put your faith in him, got to eat. The people who said that it was impossible got to eat. The people who said there was no way that you would follow this person, this basic man. There's no way he's the Messiah, for crying out loud. He was born in a manger. Those people got to eat too. There was no litmus test. Just a buffet. people who said it couldn't be done. The people who stood in the way and tried to prevent it from happening, they got to eat too. And not just them. But you remember that family that had the emergency stash of Doritos that they kept hidden because they didn't see enough to go around? Remember those people who saw only scarcity and they couldn't imagine the abundance? The people who needed to live into the example and the faith of this little child? The people who missed it when it was standing right in their face? The people who should have known better? They got to eat too. The people who showed up early, the people who stayed late and helped clean up, the people who arrived just in time for the meal and left afterwards and didn't even hear the sermon, the people who brought a to-go container because they wanted to take some home to their mama and them. Everybody who showed up got to eat, and there was no question about whether they were worthy. There was no asking about whether or not they believed. There was no litmus test or requirement. There was none of that. It was just, are you hungry? Here's some bread and some fish. We get all hung up in our world and we try and make things complicated. We try and make it hard. We ask ourselves all kinds of questions about, did they try? Did they earn it? Did they blah, 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 all of the stuff. And instead, what Jesus is telling us to do is give them some bread and some fish. That ain't even that great of a potluck. We live in a society all hung up on requirement. Do you know what that requirement's based on? Because there ain't enough to go around. We've got to have requirements and rules and restrictions because there isn't enough, because things are scarce, and yet Jesus says, and I am abundant. And that in me, the things that feel simple and scarce will be made so much more. It will be multiplied and poured out. Why are you keeping it a secret? Imagine for a moment if the family of Doritos had walked up when the kid did. They'd have had they'd have barley loaves and fish and Doritos. We have fish and chips. This is starting to feel like a meal. When culture tells us that things are scarce and that there's not enough, the answer is not to hunker down and to hide what is ours. The answer is to get more generous. The answer is to get more open, to get more willing, to recognize the abundance that comes with knowing Jesus, to recognize that give us this day our daily bread sometimes looks like I've got extra to put in the freezer, and sometimes looks like I'm going to make sure you've got yours too. Sometimes it looks like sharing what we have, and sometimes it looks like receiving because we recognize that today I'm without. Give us this day our daily bread is not a prayer, it's a lifestyle of abundance. Of recognizing that we should not be worried about the problems of today or the problems of tomorrow. See, this is a problem when I start quoting scripture from memory, I get it all wrong. We should not be worried about the problems of tomorrow, for each day has enough trouble of its own. Isn't that the truth? So if you're ready to get off of the hamster wheel of scarcity, if you're ready to stop living like there's not enough to go around and to live into the more, into the abundance of Jesus, if you're ready to let go of the promise that there's only so much pie and you got to make sure you get yours, if you're ready to let go and like that kid, trust Jesus with your loaves and fishes. Then all it takes is one little step. One moment of, even when it's terrifying and you don't feel like it, being generous. Being generous with your time. Being generous with your energy. Being generous with all kinds of things. Yeah, you could be generous with your money. I'm going to tell you, in the world we live today, if you can be generous with your attention and your time, you are making a bigger statement than you are with a check. We live in a distracted culture. Margie and I, when we occasionally get to go to dinner, we just think it's hilarious to watch these couples who have worked very hard to find babysitters and all things so that they can go to dinner, so that they can spend the whole evening staring at their phones at a very nice restaurant. Sit and listen to someone. Have a conversation. Be generous with your energy and your talent and your time. Live into the abundance that because we believe in eternity, there will always be more. Change your perspective from one of never enough to go around to one of Jesus will take what I give and multiply it and make it so much more. Take one step into a generous life. This week, today, now feels good. Try now. Because that's the life of Jesus. That's the perspective Jesus brings. One of abundance. Let us pray. Lord, help us to break free of the lie that more will make us happy. And teach us to trust you. To live open-handed and to experience true joy that comes with not living in a place of scarcity, but living sacrificially. Help us to store up the treasures that last forever.